Hello, and welcome back to the Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark 7, and today we'll be continuing with our look at the Brewster Buffalo fighter and its combat career. As usual, the sources of information for this video can be found in the description for anyone who is interested. This episode, and the next few probably, are going to be dealing with the Brewster in Finnish service, and so I'll apologize beforehand for my inevitable butchering of some of the Finnish place names, personal names, and such. That said, let's get back to our story. At the beginning of 1939, with the threat of war with the Soviet Union becoming ever more serious, the Finnish government sought for arms to purchase abroad. In April of that year, a request was put by the Finns to the Roosevelt administration to purchase American combat aircraft. This did not bear fruit until October of that year, when the Finnish embassy received a telegram authorizing the purchase of certain types of combat planes by the Finns. Finns were looking for a fighter that was available immediately and which could use 87-octane fuel. The Brewster Buffalo, early models of which were then in production for the Navy, fit this bill. On the 16th of December, a contract was signed with a New York-based manufacturer for 44 of these planes. The contract included spare parts, 10 spare engines, and 20 Hamilton Standard hydromatic propellers. The Finns paid Brewster $3.4 million. These export versions of the Navy's F-2A were known by the company's designation as the Model B-239. The first 239s were converted from F-2A-1s already under production for the original Navy contract. The Navy order would be completed later by the delivery of newer F-2A-2 models, which were then in development. The 239s differed from the F-2A-1 model then on the assembly lines by the substitution of an export-approved mark of the Wright Cyclone engine. The 239s would also have all of the Navy-specific equipment deleted. This included the tailhook and the catapult gear, the instruments, and the Navy's standard guns and gun sight. 239s would be completed with other instruments and a simple ring and bead sight. They were armed with 4 Colt 50 caliber machine guns, 2 in the nose and 1 in each wing. The modifications at the factory resulted in an aircraft with an empty weight of 3,900 pounds, or 1,770 kilograms, with a maximum takeoff weight of 5,820 pounds, or 2,400 kilograms. It can make a maximum speed of 297 miles per hour, or 475 kph, at 15,580 feet, or 4,750 meters. Reach a ceiling of 32,500 feet, or 9,900 meters, though its high-altitude performance was significantly impaired. The Finns made no reservations about this aircraft, however. Modern fighters of any kind were desperately needed. Throughout 1939, tensions with the Soviet Union were building towards a critical point, and the Red Army and Navy were amassing forces that included thousands of combat aircraft across the Karelian frontier. As it happened, the conclusion of the deal with Brewster came too late for the planes to be ready when the fighting finally started. More than 2 weeks before it was signed, the Red Army moved against Finland on the 30th of November, 48 hours after Stalin's government had canceled the non-aggression pact between the two countries. Brewster built the 44 planes on the order in 4 batches, which were shipped separately to Scandinavian ports. The first of these ships left New York Harbor for Bergen, Norway on the 13th of January 1940. The remaining 3 vessels departed at intervals of a week or two, last sailing on February 19th. The ocean passage occupied 2 weeks, after which the crated planes were shipped by rail across the Swedish border to the Saab facility at Trollhättan, near the city of Gothenburg. Here, they were assembled by volunteer personnel from the Norwegian Air Force and test flown. Test flights were conducted by a pilot from the Brewster Corporation, Robert Winston, who had been sent ahead for this purpose. It was he that took the Model 239 up for its first flight in northern European skies on February 14th. The first batch of planes was assembled and Finnish markings applied. 239s were given the serial numbers BW351 through BW394. The first group of 4 were flown onto Finnish airfields on the 1st of March. By the 1st of May, they had been joined by the rest. The Winter War was nearing its conclusion when the first few Brewsters arrived. These were assigned to Lento Liviu 22, or Fighter Squadron 22, which was abbreviated LLV 22. This was a newly created formation. 6 of the machines would arrive while the fighting continued. They flew a handful of interception missions against Soviet intruders but saw no significant combat before hostilities ended on the 13th of March. A little over a month after peace had been concluded, the 239s were reassigned to Squadron LLV-24. This unit was the Finns' premier fighter formation, and had been the intended recipient of the new American fighters when they first began to arrive in the country. But LLV-24, which was then flying Fokker D-21s, was too heavily involved in the last stages of the fighting in the Winter War to be pulled out of action and re-equipped with the new planes. After the cessation of hostilities, the squadron traded in its wartime mounts for the 239s, and would fly them first from the field at Malmi near Helsinki. Afterwards, they were based at the newly completed field at Vesivema, some distance to the north of the capital between Lahti and Heinola. By August 1940, they were established at this station. After the conclusion of hostilities, the Finns made some modifications to their 239s. An armored headrest and seat back were provided for the pilot, and the ring and bead type gun sights were replaced by reflector sights of British make. In addition, waterproof, heated cowling covers were procured to wrap the radial engines and to protect them from the worst effects of the harsh northern winters. Squadron LLV-24 would use the Brewsters for 4 years, until May of 1944, long after all other users had taken the fighter out of combat service. Thus, the Brewster 239 arrived too late to see much combat in the war for which it had been purchased. The peace with the Russians was obviously unstable, however, and the pilots of LLD-24, along with their counterparts throughout the rest of the Finnish Air Force, trained with their new aircraft intensively throughout the remainder of 1940 and into the spring of 1941. This practice would prove very valuable, as the squadron and its machines would be back in action only 15 months later. This second conflict between Finn and Russian is known appropriately as the Continuation War. Though not formally allies, the Finns fought alongside the Germans when the latter launched their invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941. The Wehrmacht High Command, glad to have the help of the soldiers and airmen who had put up such a terrific fight against Stalin's armies, had communicated its plans to their Finnish counterparts 4 weeks before the attack. For their part, the Finns were glad to have the opportunity to take back what they had been forced to cede in March 1940. The advance warning of the German invasion gave them time to mobilize their forces and deploy them for a limited offensive of their own in concert with Barbarossa. The Finnish Air Force would thus fly against the Red Air Force once again, this time aided by Luftwaffe units, such as the Bf-110 squadron of JG-77 described in a previous episode. The Finns had 125 fighters organized into 2 aviation regiments, the 2nd and the 3rd. Squadron LLV-24, flying the 239, was one of 3 assigned to Lento Reggimenti II, or the 2nd Air Regiment. The other 2 squadrons of this regiment were LLV-26, equipped with Italian Fiat G50s, and LLV-28, flying French Morane-Saulnier MS-406s. LLV-24 was led by Major Gustav Magnusson. Finnish squadrons were larger than those in most other air forces. This one fielded 33 Model 239s, divided into 4 flights. The remaining 11 were held in reserve. 9 were assigned to the squadron's first flight, commanded by Captain Aino Luukkanen, based at the field at Vesivema. 2 other flights, the 3rd and 4th, were also there, with 8 planes apiece, while the 8 fighters of the second flight were based at Salonpa, closer to the frontier towards the east. They were stationed here to provide a guard against a possible surprise raid on the main base. 2 Brewsters of the second flight of LLV-24 were the first Finnish planes to engage the enemy. They were responding to the first Soviet bombing missions across the Finnish frontier. A formation of Tupolev SB-2 twin-engine bombers was seen passing westwards over the front at 0600 hours on the 25th of June. The SBs were relatively fast machines, with a top speed of more than 275 miles per hour, or 440 kph. They were among the best in the world when introduced in the mid-1930s, capable of outrunning most contemporary fighters, and they had since proven themselves in extensive combat operations both against the Japanese in Manchuria and while flying for the Republican Air Force in the Spanish Civil War. They were part of the generation of aircraft just becoming widespread frontline equipment at the time of the Brewster fighter's development, and the kind of opponents that its designers would have had in mind. Two of the 239s took off from Salonpod and intercept them at 0710 hours. The Russian formation was made up of 27 SB-2s from the 201st High-Speed Bomber Regiment. They were in fact looking for the 24th Main Field at Vesivema, and thus the basing of the second flight at the advance post on their likely route proved wise. The two Brewsters intercepted them at an altitude of 1,500 meters as they neared the town of Heinola. Here, in its combat debut, the Brewster acquitted itself well. Between them, the two Finnish pilots, Corporal Heimo Lampi and Master Sergeant Eero Kinnunen, accounted for 5 of the Russian bombers, which were reported to have taken no evasive action in response to the fighters' attacks. Repeated raids were flown against targets in the area throughout the day, and the fighters of LLV-24 flew a total of 77 sorties against Soviet bombers that day. They shot down 10 enemy planes in all, no loss to themselves. 4 of these were the work of Sergeant Kinnunen, who also shared credit for a 5th victory this day. Combined with the 3 he had earned flying Fokkers in the Winter War, this brought his total career tally to 8. The Russian effort slackened after the strong bombing effort on the 25th, but the attacks against Finnish and German airfields would continue throughout the rest of June. Despite the slower pace of operations, the Finnish Brewster pilots claimed another 12 Russian aircraft shot down before the end of the month. 2 of these kills were the work of a 3rd flight pilot, Lieutenant Pekka Koka, who brought down 2 of the Soviet Navy's MBR-2 flying boats over the Gulf of Finland on the 29th. The results of the Russian bombing offensive were negligible. 2 Finnish machines were damaged in the raids, but not seriously. The German units had mostly moved forward since the beginning of the assault, and the Soviet bombers hit fields they had already abandoned. LLV-24 moved forwards themselves not long after. Along with the other fighter squadrons, they were given the task of supplying fighter protection to the Army of Karelia, a 100,000-man Finnish ground formation. The mission of this army was to retake the territory lost in the Winter War in Lapland and in the region north of Lake Ladoga. The troops massing south of the lake for this attack had become the target of Soviet bombers of the 72nd High-Speed Bomber Regiment, now escorted by fighters from the 115th, 179th, 197th, and 415th Fighter Regiments, all of which, along with the bombers, were part of the 55th Mixed Aviation Division under the control of the 7th Army. On July 8th, the Brewsters were back in combat against these forces. LLV-24's pilots were credited with 8 kills in 3 separate combats on this day. 2 of these victories were claimed by Sergeant Lauri Nissinen. These were a pair of I-153 biplane fighters. This type of aircraft was a development of the I-15, a mid-30s design that was contemporary with the SB bomber, and it had also seen extensive combat service in Spain, where it had become known as the Chateau, and also against the Japanese in Manchuria. The I-153 differed from the I-15 in having a more powerful supercharged engine, faster firing machine gun armament, and a retractable undercarriage. Because of the distinctive form of its upper wing, the I-153 was often known as the Chaika, a Russian word for seagull. Nissinen added these 2 victories to 4 credited to him during the Winter War, and thus became one of 2 Finnish pilots who passed 5 victories and achieved ace status flying the 239 this day. His report states that although the Brewster was quite agile at low altitude, it was outmatched by the Chaika in a level dogfight, where the Russian machine could outturn the 239 and be on its tail in 4 or 5 circles. The Brewster, however, had a considerable speed advantage over the Russian biplane. The second Finn to make ace on the 8th was the squadron commander, Major Magnusson, who shot down one of the Russians' big 4-engine Tupolev TB-3 bombers. The next day, Magnusson was back in action, leading a formation of 12 Brewsters, which became involved in a sharp encounter battle with a force of 15 Russian planes, bombers escorted by more I-153 fighters. The Finns claimed 8 of the Russian machines. 2 of these were claimed by Warrant Officer Ilmari Jutalainen, flying Brewster serial number BW364. Following is an excerpt from his combat report, describing his attack on the second I-153. Quote, I then went after the 2 aircraft that Lieutenant Karhunen had initially attacked. They were heading for Sarola Island, and I held off attacking them until the trailing I-153 had formed back up with his leader. I then dived in behind the wingman and fired off half a dozen rounds with both fuselage guns. My wing guns did not work at all throughout this fight. The I-153 dived away to port, rolled over on its back and crashed into Lake Ladoga. My engine then began to run roughly, so I broke off my chase of the lead aircraft and returned home. These were his third and fourth victories. Juutilainen's account illustrates two common features of the Brewster's combat career: the use of the diving firing pass and the unreliability of the aircraft's armament, especially the wing-mounted guns. He would shortly become the next Finnish Brewster ace when he brought down another I-153 on the 21st. On this day, he was flying one of the Third Flight's aircraft and had gone up against a formation of Soviet fighters from the 65th Air Attack Regiment, which was carrying out strafing attacks against the Finnish army near Katkasalmi. The northward push of the Army of Karelia had begun on the 10th, and though the Russian response in the air was slow to begin, Russian planes were targeting the Finnish advance. A major Finnish move against the Karelian Isthmus was set to begin on the 31st. Among the Finnish air units tasked with its support was LLV-24's Third Flight, with 7 Brewsters. Russian air units opposing them in this sector included the 153rd Fighter Regiment and the 65th and 235th Air Attack Regiments. Action in this sector began right away, and on the 1st of August, the Third Flight, led by Lieutenant Jorma Karhunen, went up against a formation of I-16s. This was a short fuselaged radial engine monoplane fighter, a contemporary of the I-153 biplane fighter and the SP-2 bomber, which had also seen extensive combat service since the mid-1930s. In Spain, these had been the most formidable fighters on the Republican side, and were dubbed the Rata. In some ways, the I-16 was very similar to the Brewster. In this clash, though, the American-built machine proved dominant in Finnish hands. 7 Brewsters brought down 6 I-16s, 2 of them the work of Juutilainen. This pilot would write in his after-action report that the 239 was more agile and faster climbing than the Russian monoplane, though others would rate the Rata as the more maneuverable of the two. Karhunen, promoted to captain, led the Brewsters back into heavy combat on the 12th, when one of the fiercest clashes between Finns and Soviets over the isthmus took place. 6 239s patrolling near Antrea found about 20 I-153s of the 65th Air Attack Regiment engaged in a ground attack mission against Finnish infantry. The Finns dove into the attack at 1300 hours, and a huge sprawling dogfight erupted. Combat between the Brewsters and the biplanes lasted for a half hour, during which time the Finns shot down 9 of the Russian planes. 2 of these were credited to Sergeant Niels Katijainen, who thus became the first pilot to score 5 victories in the 239. The Finnish tactic used against the Russian fighters was dubbed the Pendulum attack. In this, the Brewsters would approach from a higher altitude, then make diving attacks on the slower enemy planes. They would use the speed built up in the dive to disengage, then pull back up to attack height before repeating the diving attack. On the 21st of August, the Army of Karelia had reached the objectives of the first phase of its advance, and was pausing to regroup before pushing on with the next stage. During the lull in operations that resulted, the 1st, 3rd, and 4th flights of Squadron LLV-24 were pulled back to the base at Imola to rest and refit. 3rd Flight remained on duty near the fighting front. And so that is where I will end this video. Next time we'll continue with the story of the Brewster's part in the air war over the Finnish front. Until then, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.